Welcome students to this session on Materials Requirement Planning in Operations Management. In this session, we will be discussing about materials management, different types of materials, materials requirements planning, MRP as it is commonly known as, what are the requisites of material requirement planning, the need for material requirement planning, what are the different terminology used in material requirement planning, what are the inputs and outputs in material requirements planning, the difference between material requirements planning and capacity requirement planning, that is MRP and CRP, what is the difference between these, and some examples of inputs and outputs in MRP. Let us start with materials requirement planning now. Material requirement planning or MRP is a computer-based technique for determining the quantity and timing for the acquisition of dependent demand items needed to satisfy the master schedule requirements. So here you can come across some terms which will be introduced to you in the session one by one. So basically, what is MRP? MRP is a computer-based technique. A technique which makes use of computer for determining the quantity. It can be done manually also, but since there are so many materials involved in an organization, materials in the form of raw materials in progress or work in progress, materials which are under process, materials which have come out of the processing unit, that is outputs. There are other items which are used on regular basis, not for production but for administration work, which you call as supplies. So all these things, there are lots of hundreds and thousands of materials in an organization. So managing them manually is very difficult. So even though MRP is also exercised manually, basically it is based on a computer-based technique for determining the quantity. So why MRP is used? It is a technique, computer-based technique for determining the quantity and timing, how much to procure and when to procure. For what? For acquisition of dependent demand items. For the acquisition of dependent demand items needed to satisfy the master schedule requirements. So we will understand each of these terms in the subsequent slides. One by one, we will discuss what are the different terms used in MRP. Next, by identifying precisely what is required, in how many quantities it is required and when it is required, components, whichever components are to be managed or are to be handled, we need to identify them precisely in what quantity they are required, in how much quantity they are required, and when they are required. So this particular point says, by identifying precisely what, how many and when components are needed, MRP systems are able to reduce inventory costs, improve scheduling effectiveness, and respond quickly to market changes. So one of the major applications of MRP is to reduce inventory costs, to improve scheduling effectiveness, and respond quickly to market change. So MRP systems, if initiated or applied, will help in reducing inventory costs, will help in improving the scheduling effectiveness, and will also help in responding quickly to market changes. Computerized MRP systems can effectively manage the flow of thousands of components throughout a manufacturing facility. This computerized material requirement planning systems can effectively manage the flow of thousands of components throughout a manufacturing facility. Next, capacity requirement planning. We discussed there are two types of planning which we will be discussing about in this particular slide. One is materials requirement planning, MRP. The second one is capacity requirement planning. What is capacity requirement planning? Capacity requirement planning, or CRP as it is commonly known as, is the process of determining what personnel and equipment capacities, that is capacities expressed in times, are needed to meet the production objectives in the master schedule and the materials requirement plan. So it is a part of MRP. So a CRP is also a part of MRP. Or in other words, we can define CRP as a process of determining what are the personnel, that is a human resource required, and equipment capacities in terms of capacities in hours or in time units. So CRP is the process of determining what personnel and equipment capacities in terms of times are needed to meet the production objectives in the master schedule and the MRP, or the material requirements plan. Whereas MRP focuses upon priorities of materials. MRP focuses on priority. We saw how much and when it is required. Based on how much it is required, what materials, when they are required, and in how many quantity. Whereas CRP focuses mainly on time. Correct. Now time here again refers to the capacity. That's why it's called CRP, capacity requirement planning. So MRP focuses upon priorities of materials and CRP focuses primarily upon time. Though both MRP and CRP can be done manually, they are often integrated with a computerized system. We already discussed, since very huge amount of materials are to be handled, it becomes very cumbersome and very difficult for the analysis to be done manually. So a computerized system for faster results and much more organized results is done through a computerized system. CRP functions are often assumed to be included within the concept of MRP system. So CRP functions are often part of the MRP system. They are not an exclusive functions. In most of the cases, they are integral to the MRP system. MRP determines what components are needed and when they should be ordered from outside vendor or produced in-house. So one of the functions of MRP is to determine what components are needed and when they should be ordered from outside vendor or produced in-house. So MRP determines what components are needed, the number of quantity, what components, identification of the components, and when they should be ordered from outside vendor or when they should be produced in-house. That you can either procure from outside vendor or you can have your own in-house facility where your production, the component that you are seeking, will be supplied to you. CRP function will translate these MRP decisions into hours of capacity or the time needed. So CRP function will translate MRP decisions into hours of capacity time needed. So whatever MRP that is been designed, CRP will translate those MRP decisions into the capacity in terms of time units. That is what it means. Let us discuss about MRP terminology, some of the commonly used terms in MRP. First one, MRP, as we have already discussed. MRP is a technique for determining the quantity and timing of dependent demand items. So MRP, again I repeat, MRP is a technique for determining the quantity and timing of dependent demand items. Now what is dependent demand? Let us see. Dependent demand is demand for components that is derived from the demand for other items. So demand for components that is derived from the demand for other items. For example, if the demand for say construction of houses, newly constructed houses, now increases over a period of time, the components, or let me say the things related to the something that is related to it, for example cement, bricks, etc., all things which are required for construction, they will be dependent on the demand for the construction of the houses, correct? Similarly, if I say an assembled unit of a, say, automobile, for example, is a parent item, so the dependent components in that, the components that go into the final assembly, those will also have dependent demand based on the demand for the parent product. So parent product, if it gets a demand, obviously all the components that go into the final assembly of this parent component will also have demand. So demand of these components are actually dependent on the demand of the final, the parent, correct? That is why we call it as dependent demand of the components, that is derived from the demand for other items. Increase in demand for a particular item causes an increase in demand for some other components of that item. Such demand is called dependent demand. Next, parent and component items. So parent is an assembly made up of basic parts or components. So the parent is an assembly made up of basic parts or components. So the parent of one subgroup may be a component of a higher level parent. So every component, a final assembled component or a product, is a parent because it's an assembly made of basic parts or components. A fully assembled product becomes a parent, and all the components which go into that final assembled product will be the subcomponents or the components. So the parent of one subgroup may be a component of a higher level parent. So that final product which you are now analyzing could be a component of some other parent, something which is now totally a higher level parent, correct? So each one is a component of some other higher level parent. Next, bill of materials. Now, very common term used in MRP terminology. Now this bill of materials becomes very important because it is the listing of all components, including the sub-assemblies as well as the materials that will go into an assembled item. For example, when I say one unit of a laptop, for example, a laptop that you are using, so listing of all the components, sub-assemblies and materials that go into an assembled laptop will be put in the form of either a document or in the form of a list, which will include the part numbers as well as the quantity required per assembly. So bill of materials here refers to a listing of all components, sub-assemblies and materials that will go into an assembled item. So one final product which will have different components, so that particular product and a breakup of that particular product with a list of all the subcomponents, components that go into the final assembly, which will have its part numbers, labels or the part numbers, and also the quantity required per assembly. For one unit of, say, a final product X, what are the different subcomponents that are required, correct? That is given in the form of a bill of materials, which you commonly denote as BOM, bill of materials. A common mistake which most students do is when they say bill of materials, they simply think it is the cash invoice or the invoice or the receipt of any material. No, bill of materials is not the cash bill in operations management terminology, or specifically in MRP terminology. Bill of materials means listing of all components that go into an assembled item. This includes sub-assemblies as well as materials, and it also includes the part numbers and the quantity required per assembly. Next, the level codes. Now we have discussed about bill of materials, the level on which an item occurs in the structure or bill of materials format. So every item which is in the bill of materials structure will have a level, correct? So bill of materials also will have a format, which we will discuss subsequently in the later stage. So level on which an item occurs in the structure, there will be different levels on which an item will occur in the structure in the bill of materials format, that is the level code. And what is requirements explosion? So this is the breaking down of the parent item into component parts that can be individually planned and scheduled. So every parent item will have a demand and will have a requirement. So if I want to know about one unit of a parent item, if I break that into different components, then each component will have its own dependent demand, correct? So that can be individually planned if I make a requirements explosion. What I'm doing is I'm actually breaking down the entire product demand into components demand by going to the next level, correct? That is what this requirements explosion mean. Continuing with the terminologies, next is time phasing. What is time phasing? Time phasing refers to scheduling, that is scheduling to produce or receive an appropriate amount of material. Material is all most cases uh, is produced or received in lots. Lots means a batch, a lot of say 100, 200. That lot will be there is a the quantitative analysis is sometimes done to look arrive at that particular lot, like economic order quantity, etc. So these lots will be now first formulated. First the lots will be made, and the ordering, the production or receipt of any material will be based on lots in most of the cases. So time phasing is scheduling to produce or receive an appropriate amount or lot of material so that it will be available in the time periods when required or when needed. What is time bucket? Time bucket is a time period used for planning purposes. The entire time period, say from the point of say making an order to the receipt. So the time period used for the planning purposes in MRP, that's just an example which I give. Time period can even extend beyond that time bucket. So the time period which is used for planning purposes in MRP is usually denoted by the term time bucket. Lot size. Again, lot size, we have seen here, we have discussed about lot here. So that what is that lot size? The quantity of items required for an order. So every order will be done in lot size. So the order may be either purchased from a vendor from outside or produced in-house. If you are making the product yourself, then you will be ordering it from the production department. So you will have your own facility for production. So the in-house production unit will be your supplier, your internal supplier. So the order may be either purchased from an outside vendor or will be produced in-house. So lot sizing is the process of specifying the order size. How much quantity is required in one order. In one order, what is the lot or the batch that you are expecting, that you are ordering from the vendor. Lead time offset. Lead time is another very important point in materials management, especially in MRP. Lead time, the moment you make an order, the time from the time or the phase from where you make an order, place an order officially, to the receipt of the material, the time taken from the order to the receipt of the material, that is a lead time. And what is the offset? Lead time offset is the supply time or the number of time buckets between releasing an order and receiving the materials. So when you release an order officially, your order is made, and when you receive the materials in physically, no promises, you have to receive the material at your end, only then that transaction is over, correct? The supplier supplies you materials for an exchange of money, correct? And you receive the materials by giving some money. So the transaction is complete only when both parties are happy, correct? So the supply time or number of time buckets between releasing an order and receiving the materials. This is the lead time offset. So these are some of the terms that we use in MRP. We will be using this often in the subsequent slide. Let us now see some more terms and logic that we use in MRP. One is gross requirements. When we talk about materials and ordering gross requirements, what is gross requirement? The term gross here refers to the projected needs for raw materials and components, sub-assemblies or finished goods by the end by the end of the period shown. So projected needs for raw materials, components, sub-assemblies or finished goods by the end of the period shown. These requirements come from the master schedule for the end items or from the combined needs of other items. So whenever there is a requirement from the master schedule or from the combined needs of other items, whatever the projected needs are based on the demand, that is your gross requirements, the total, in total, what is the requirement That can include your raw materials, your components which are working, which are in the pipeline of production, sub-assemblies, finished goods, other things, etc. All these things will come in gross requirements. So the projected needs for raw materials, components, sub-assemblies or finished goods by the end of the period shown, these are gross requirements. These requirements come from the master schedule or from the combined needs of other items. Scheduled receipts. What are scheduled receipts? These are the materials already on order from a vendor or an in-house shop due to be received at the beginning of the period. So you have a gross requirement and you have already ordered. So the scheduled receipts here refer to materials which are already ordered. You have ordered from a vendor or from an in-house shop, but you have not received it. Order is made, but you have not received the material. So it becomes a scheduled receipt. The order is placed, supplier has been told about the order and is in the process of supplying you the supply, but you have not received it. It is scheduled receipts. Correct? So the materials already on order from a vendor or in-house shop due to be received at the beginning of the period. MRP form shows quantity and projected time of receipt. The MRP document or the form will show the quantity and the projected time of receipt. So there will be an agreement between you, the purchaser, and the supplier. You will be specifying the quantity and the time of receipt will be already mutually discussed between both of you. The credit policy as well as the time of receipt will be mutually discussed between supplier and purchaser. So the projected time will also be known and that will be mentioned in the MRP document or the form. On hand availability or on hand available stock. So if materials which are on order not to be yet to be received are scheduled receipts. Now on hand or available are the quantity which is expected to be available at the end of the time period and in which it is shown. For example, it could be the amount available from previous period. Some you have ordered for from the previous period and some of it is not utilized. It's still with you. So that is an on hand stock that is in your hand, which is in your premises. So that is in your hand. So the quantity expected to be available at the end of the time period in which it is shown. So this includes material available from the previous period, plus the planned order receipts and scheduled receipts less the gross requirements. For example, you have a gross requirement of say 1000 units. You have already ordered 600 units from the vendor, already ordered 600 units from the vendor, correct? Okay, and 400 units you already have from the previous week's 400 units are there with you on hand. So 400 which is already with you, 600 already you have placed the order and you will be receiving it by tomorrow or day after tomorrow, and your requirement is say 1 week later, for example, a very hypothetical example, correct? Now what will happen now is, if that is the case, now how can you find out if will whatever you have done, will whatever quantity you are planning now be available to you when you actually want, when it is required? Yes, because 400 units are with you, 600 units will be available tomorrow, and you require 1000 units a day after tomorrow, on next week. So yes, that will work out. But what if the gross requirements and scheduled receipts, if the supplier does not supply within the specified time, that is also a possibility. The supplier may sometimes not supply to you in time because of some reasons, correct? So in that case, this 400 quantity which you have is not enough. Whichever is in hand is not enough for you, correct? Not enough. You might have to make one more order, then one more order you may have to make. So that or such orders such orders are called as planned orders. That is, material that will be ordered from a vendor or an in-house shop to be received at the beginning of the period. Otherwise it is similar to scheduled receipt. So the planned order receipt, materials that will be ordered from a vendor or an in-house shop to be received at the beginning of the period. So scheduled receipt was one that you have ordered already and is yet to come, Planned order is you have not made the order at all. You are going to order it and you are expecting the vendor to supply it to you in the beginning of the period. So that's the difference between planned order and scheduled order. Otherwise both are same. Planned order which you have not yet ordered, whereas scheduled receipt is one which you have already ordered and you are expecting the lot to come. It has not come, but you are expecting it to come. Planned order receipt is which you have not yet ordered. You are going to order it from the in-house shop or from the vendor, and which will be received at the beginning of the period. What are net requirements? Net amount needed in the period. So this will be the gross requirement minus any projected inventory available from the previous period along with any scheduled receipts. So net requirements will always be less than the gross requirement. So gross requirement minus any projected inventory available from the previous period or something that you have in hand or something that you have already ordered, correct? You have to deduct these things from gross requirements, then you will get the net requirements. So planned order receipt, again we have already discussed. Planned order release. What is planned order release? The planned amount to be ordered in the time period adjusted by the lead time offset. And this is pertaining to the planned order receipt. So when, if the planned order receipt is the materials that will be ordered at the beginning of the period from the vendor, the release time or the released amount, how much you are going to, in what quantity you are going to place the planned order receipt, that is the planned order release. In how much quantity you are releasing this receipt, planned order receipt, that is planned order release. So the amount or the planned amount to be ordered in the time period adjusted by the lead time offset, so that the materials will be received on schedule. You have to take into account the lead time. We have mentioned lead time is what? Lead time is the time required or the time taken from the point of order to the point of delivery. So the moment you order something, from that point onwards to the receipt of the material, that is the lead time. And the offset is, that's offset, the buffer that you create, the offset. We already discussed this in the previous slide. So planned order release is always the amount, quantity to be ordered in the time period adjusted by the lead time offset, so that the materials will be received on schedule. Now small note here, once the orders are actually released, once you actually release the order, the planned order releases are deleted from the form and the planned order receipts they generated are changed to scheduled receipts. So scheduled receipts are nothing but planned order receipts which are executed. Both are same. Scheduled receipts and planned order receipts are same. Only difference is scheduled receipts where order is already done but material is expected. In planned order, yet to be ordered. So planned order receipts will be generated and changed to scheduled receipts once the order are made, once the order is made. So this note says once the orders are actually released, the planned order releases are deleted from the form and the planned order receipts that they generated are changed to scheduled receipts. So this is the different terms or the logic of MRP. Let us see what are some of the MRP inputs. So one input of MRP is the master production schedule of end items, MPS of the end items, inventory status file of on hand and on order items which will determine the lot sizes, lead times, etc. Product structure, BOM or the bill of materials file of what components and sub-assemblies go into each product. So a major input of MRP is the master production schedule of the end items. The production schedule of each one of these components, end items are required. So that becomes the input to MRP because the timing is important here. Materials for that, materials for the production of those end items, the scheduling timing, when it starts, when it completes, that is important. Those are very essential inputs to MRP. Inventory status file of on hand and on order items. Inventory status file of on hand, how many, what is the inventory available on hand, on order items, lot sizes, lead times, etc. All these should be fed into the MRP as inputs. Only then you will have an effective MRP system. The product structure or the bill of materials file of what components and sub-assemblies which go into each end product. So these are major inputs to the MRP system. Now let us see what are the MRP outputs. The order release data to capacity requirement planning for load profiles. So once these inputs are processed, what is the output of MRP? The order release, the data, the purchase order or the order release data will be sent to the capacity requirement planning profile or load profiles. So that will be generated through the outputs of MRP. Now again, orders for purchasing, orders to purchasing and in-house production shops, to outside vendors as well as in-house production shops, depending upon the as the case may be. Rescheduling data to MPS. Again, in any case, there are some discrepancies or some control measures to be taken, some improvements to be done. Again, rescheduling data can be rescheduled and sent back to MPS, and that will again a new refined input will come into MRP, and the same will be generated as a output. Management reports and inventory updates. Any updates, management reports, some expansion or some changes in the existing system. If you have anything midway through an MRP process or an MRP experience, you have to immediately give it back or send the signal back to the MRP input. So this again comes under rescheduling. This again a rescheduling point, rescheduling part activity. Management reports, inventory. You may have to generate reports. No output. Any output has to be documented. So management reports and inventory updates may have to be made. Correct, in changes, etc. So these are another the different types of outputs that you can expect in MRP. Correct. Now let us see a small. This is looks very compact flow chart of capacity of MRP and CRP. MRP and CRP. Most of you will be the common confusion is what is MRP and CRP. Now we have already discussed enough points now, so it should be very clear to you the difference between MRP and CRP. MRP deals with the materials, solely with the materials, their timing, their requirements, quantity, etc. CRP will always deal with capacity. So the CRP will be supporting the function of materials management through capacity estimation, capacity in terms of timings, correct, timings. So capacity of machines, equipments, etc. Right. So let us see here. I will just show you the aggregate plan master schedule. MPS we said is the major input. So these become the inputs. You can see here MRP. The inputs here are the aggregate plan and master schedule. Whatever you have done in aggregate plan and master schedule, the outputs of that, all decisions like your outsourcing, contracting, or workforce scheduling, etc. The inputs of that, and also the inputs of the outputs of master scheduling. The outputs of this will be the inputs to MRP. So aggregate plan master schedule outputs will be the input to MRP, or in other words, aggregate plan and master schedule will be the input to MRP. And there is the bill of materials, BOM, and the inventory status. How much inventory is there? What is the status of inventory, etc. So that will be one of the inputs. So three major inputs here: inventory status, bill of materials, and aggregate plan and master schedule, MRP. Now the output of that are the planned orders. We have seen in the previous slide. One output is the order, planned order. Now the planned order will have to be again analyzed. Now are the materials adequate here? Are the materials adequate? If yes, if the materials are adequate, because the planned orders have been generated, correct? Planned orders have been generated. Now, if they are adequate, they will be sent back to the CRP or the capacity requirement planning phase, because if the materials are adequate, they will be now synthesized at this particular point, analyzed at the capacity requirement planning phase, CRP phase, correct? At the CRP phase. Now if they are not, planned orders or the materials are not adequate, then the orders have to be rescheduled, and they will be again fed as inputs to the master schedule or the aggregate plan, and again after synthesizing, refining, they will be again sent to the MRP. So this is a flow chart here. There are two possibilities. These planned orders may be satisfactory, that is materials may be adequate, so they will be sent directly to CRP, capacity requirement planning package, or if no, the orders will be rescheduled now, because that previous scheduling does not work. does not give you results. So reschedule, and it will be sent as an input to the aggregate plan and synthesized or be processed, and the output will be the input to this MRP, and this cycle will go on. Right. Now if the materials are again here, there are two different ways in which you can look here. If the materials are again adequate, one more thing is you release the order. That is another thing. Release the order. You release the order and send it to the production activity control. Now you can see here in capacity requirement planning, the inputs are the shop routing file and the work center status. Work center, how much equipment is there, how much labor is there, equipment, machineries, etc. WC here refers to work center. WC refers to work center, correct, where the work is actually taking place. The shop routing file is routing the sequence or the arrangement, and how the actual stream channel of allocating work to different machines is done. That is the routing file. These are the inputs to CRP, and the output of that is the load projection reports. Now if the capacity is adequate, then what you are doing is, yes, if the capacity is adequate, what will happen? They will come to this particular point. Are materials adequate? If the materials are adequate here, they will again be sent to the production activity control. Correct. So this planned orders, rescheduling orders, released orders. You can see here three orders. These are the planned orders. Correct. Now if want to refine it, reschedule it and send it back. Otherwise release the order, or you can, some part of it can be sent to the CRP, capacity requirement planning. Correct. Similarly here, if everything works out fine, capacity is adequate according to you, then the process is, so you can see here the process is finalized here. It is sent to the production activity control, which will take decisions on priority control and capacity control. Correct. Now if it is not, you can revise this MPS, again send as an input to aggregate plan, and then again the process will continue. Correct. Now workload reports will be generated here. Now for production activity control, two major inputs here will be the workload reports. These are the two major inputs to production activity control. Workload, will be assigned, how much workload is required. See, these are the quantity of materials. These are again, as I told you, capacity, equipments, each equipment, how much load each equipment will take. You have 10 machines, you need to know which of these machines will take bulk of the load. Correct. Equipment, only then the materials, you can assign materials to it. Correct. So workload reports are a major input to production activity control, also the released orders. So this entire flow chart will give you an essence of how MRP, the inputs to MRP, outputs to MRP, what CRP is, a relationship between MRP and CRP. In general, this is a snapshot of this particular flow chart will give you idea of all the terms which I have used so far, especially the inputs outputs of MRP, which are basically very important, and how you can restructure your entire process here through again sending it back. That's the control measure which we are talking about. In operations management, we also talk about control measures, right? That's what we are doing here. When we see that it's not conforming to what we have set, you refine it back, send it back to the major input, and then the process starts again. So this is a very important flow chart from the point of view of understanding your aggregate plan and master schedule as an input to MRP, inventory status files, bill of materials, shop routing files, work center status, and you come across different types of reports that are either outputs or intermediary there will be intermediary documents which are required for you to check whether the entire process is going in the right direction or not. Correct. So this particular session will make you just get an insight into what MRP is, how it is different from CRP, the various terminology that has been discussed so far. Hope you have understood it. And now we need to see how the bill of materials will look like. Bill of materials will always give you a description, as I told you, about the components, correct? The parent item as well as the components. So once you've understood this basic concept of MRP, you've understood about what MRP is, you've understood about various terms used in MRP, CRP, so flowchart you've seen inputs and outputs of MRP. So in the subsequent session, we will be discussing about bill of materials, the different structures of bill of material, and how these bill of materials are helpful for us to understand the requirements of materials.